which is effects on fire on GSOB and other invasive tree pests. So actually, Kathleen, yours was a really good segue into this next section. For this section, our presenter is Tom Scott. He's a professor of extension in natural resources at the Environmental Science Policy and Management Department in UC Berkeley. So Tom, if you wanna take the mic.
Sure. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Perfect. For some reason, you guys have, I think you've stopped my video feed. So I guess I can give my talk. Let's see if I can share my screen.
It happened before. I think probably we can fix it.
Give it a try now, Tom. I think it should work now.
Okay. Let me get out of yeah, there it is. Okay, perfect. So now I have to go back and get my start. I've thrown myself off in a minor way. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. Or actually, am I sharing my screen? It's the first question. And start my slide presentation and share my screen. This all seemed so easy a moment ago. So can you guys see my screen?
Not yet.
No, we can't see.
Okay. So share my, can you guys see my screen now?
No.
How
Oh,
about
wait.
now.
Something is happening.
Yes,
Yeah.
we can see it.
Yay. Okay. So let me. Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about invasive pests and wildfires, and I can't really do that without talking about oak life history as well. In fact, my feeling was that when I got this assignment from my colleague, I thought, you know, when you start talking about interactions, everything kind of goes to hell, because every kind of interaction has a certain kind of degree of intensity, and they can vary and they can change each other. And so I want to start by sort of tugging on the characteristics of coast live oak before we go into talk about wildfire and pests. I have to say they're beautiful weeds. I mean, they occupy the transition zone between forests and grasslands or shrub areas, and they're remarkably good at occupying and holding on to habitat. In fact, when I started my job with the university 35 years ago, it was a integrated hardwood range management program, and they said, well, we've got to solve these problems with oaks, and couldn't see that many in coast live oak because they're everywhere. They have good recruitment and they live forever. There wasn't a single reason to manage them until we had this beetle come on from Arizona. Proof of this, you can look back in the 1930s, and there was a remarkable amount of land use that was very destructive to the landscape at the time. There were things like overuse of rangelands, dry farming, orchards. You can all see them in this aerial photograph from 1928. And if you look at the same area in 1990, it's pretty obvious that the oaks are not only there, they've actually flourished. So coast live oak is a very, very resilient species. In fact, here's the 2008 Cedar Fire. I'm glad we had a good talk about fire initially, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about involves fire. But you can see in this picture an awful lot of damage. And if you look only 13 years later, the landscape is remarkably recovered, and you can see a whole lot of coast live oak very happy. So why does this happen? Why is coast live oak such a beautiful weed? Well, there are 4 life history traits. And I think that these are the things that contribute to its remarkable success. One is resprouting and really plastic biomass. Another one is acorns and masting. The third is having a reliable root system, and the fourth is having a very thick bark. The latter two are survival. The second one I mentioned actually has to do with recruitment. And the idea of changing your biomass is just something that makes them remarkably strong. Now, if you look at the growth of a coast live oak, generally you could sort of say that we start with seedlings, then we have saplings. And in this graph, I guess I should introduce it a little bit more, but this is a graph of the size of trees relative to different life stages. And you can imagine that you get out here to the end, and I'm sure you've seen this, that oaks decline for a very long time. And the reason that they reach a peak at their height is they usually are capturing all the resources and growing to as big as they can get. And they also have a reproductive threshold, but it doesn't take a giant tree to have acorns. You can get this often in a very short period of time. So when you try to take that graph I just gave you, which is kind of the optimized, and go out and look at oaks in the landscape, you can see them doing all kinds of things. They can basically be in stasis as a seedling for dozens of years. They can jump into the canopy. They can be struck by lightning. And every time they seem to have a way of matching the biomass to exactly what's available in terms of resources. Now, that said, they have another great technique for persistence, and that's that mom and dad pack a really good lunch for the kids. Acorns are a marvelous way of giving a package of carbohydrates, which allow the seedling to establish a very deep root system and to keep being damaged, browsed on, seeking areas where there's not a lot of light. Anyway, any kind of possible problems they can live through for a very long time. And the other part of this is oaks mast, which means they create a lot of acorns at once. You combine those two things, and this is basically a strategy for going through bad times and good times. And if you look at the kind of rainfall that we get, and this is Cuyamaca Reservoir in Southern California, even in times when we didn't think we were having global change, you can see that we have peaks in rainfall and periods where we don't get as much rainfall. And we have times where we have an enormous amount of rainfall and then have a very small amount of rainfall. So if you turn out a lot of acorns at once and they all have a lot of resources, you can sort of cue that to matching times when we have good rainfall. And what happens is when you look at the standing age structure of trees, you can see these peaks because you have a lot of trees of a certain age. They all recruited at times when there were good rainfall. So that's what an acorn does for these trees, is it gives it the opportunity to take advantage of these peaks and to survive through the troughs. Now, the other thing that's remarkable about these trees is their rooting systems. I mean, people have talked about how deep they are. Sometimes it just sounds like hyperbole, but in this case, I wanted to show you a tree that basically its roots are 14 meters away from, let's translate that, 45 feet away from the tree trunk, and they're 10 meters deep in the ground. And it just happened they got uncovered by erosion, but you can see that the vadose zone here is 10 meters below ground and it's 14 meters away from the tree. And by sending roots out this way, they get reliable water during times of drought. And that's not just the drought that we have, in terms of what we get every 3 or 4 years, or the droughts that you see that are annual. It also takes care of that summer drought that we have every year. So in a sense now, evaporation and precipitation really drive the systems for Southern California. They have a tremendous impact on oaks life histories, and they also affect wildfires, as we heard this morning, and affect pests. So in a sense, rainfall is the puppet master of our systems. It's not the pests themselves or wildfires. These things really are exacerbated or aided by wildfire or by rainfall. So the last part about survivorship is oaks have these really thick barks, and you heard about those as well. Yeah, I thought that Max was going to steal all my thunder, but basically, this is a remarkable way to protect a tree. And in fires, you can get this great insulation that allows the cambium, which is the surface right here, which has the basically where all the cells are growing, and also has the buds to have recovery after a fire, aren't damaged because there's enough insulating tissue to keep these tissues from being burned. It's a great place to store carbohydrates. You know, most trees don't have this much storage in their bark. And finally, it's also a really good way to recover from damage. And I want to point out this thin white area of this particular tree, and it's in the middle of the bark, but it's actually callus tissue. So what these oaks are capable of doing is when something damages the bark or something damages the cambium, then you have callus tissue that can actually form around it. In some ways, this walls off this problem, but in other ways, after 4 or 5 years, this actually becomes vascular tissue again. So whereas the vascular tissue can be destroyed here by an insect pest, you can get the new growth of vascular tissue to the point where the tree can completely recover from a problem that's occurred. And again, because the bark is so thick, oaks, coast live oaks can do this. So how does that translate into wildfire? Well, the very first thing that people notice about oak woodlands is that often wildfires don't seem to touch them. Flames will come through, even in Santa Ana fires, and you can see that an area that might have chaparral on one side in an oak woodland, the chaparral may be completely lost after the wildfire, but the oak canopy often persists, even in a green form, that is, without having a lot of wilting and leaf damage. So what I wanted to point out was we've had 2 major fires and very damaging fires in San Diego County, one the Cedar Fire and the other the Witch Fire, 4 years apart, both catastrophic. Here's the oak woodland before that pair of fires occurred, and here's the oak woodland afterwards. So the trees literally are living through a fire, and a year later, it's as if the fire never occurred. Now, one of the reasons they do that is because they have this deep root system and can bring water up into the canopy, so the canopies are wet. The trunks themselves are 40% water. They have a remarkable ability of holding water. And so again, it's wet tissue in a fire, which is much harder to combust. So the thick bark on top of that just allows them to persist. So we can say that they're exceptionally resistant to wildfire and wildfire damage. That is, until they're not. Here's a picture of an oak woodland after this 2007 conflagration moved through, and there isn't a lot of green woody biomass still standing. And how does that happen? How do we burn an oak woodland when I've just told you that they have all these resources to keep that from happening? Well, sometimes you can have intact oak trees, which then start to slowly decline. In some cases, you can have rapid decline where they die so quickly the leaves fail to abscise. And so by doing that, you actually have leaves which are held in the canopy for a year or two. So really flashy fuels. So it can end up with a buildup of this flammable material inside the oak woodland. And that includes ladder fuels that can actually push up into the canopy and take the fire there, and a lot of wood. And eventually you get the amount of dead and burnable material relative to the amount of green material is shifted, and that's what can propel a fire. So here's that same woodland I show you though, and it's pretty much burned and destroyed. But only 2 years later, you can already see oak canopy starting to emerge. And by 2021, which is only you gotta do my math. It's only 14 years later, you have a canopy which is actually returned to the point where you could never tell it was a fire. How does that happen? Well, again, having this really thick bark system means that the cambium is protected. There are buds which are dormant along the surface of the cambium, and as soon as the tree canopy burns, epicormic buds will start to appear in this tissue, and in a very short time, you can have a canopy which is starting to reconstruct itself. So even when they do burn, they can rejoin the canopy and create a canopy structure very quickly, as opposed to an awful lot of trees, such as the white oaks, which tend to have to start from the root crown. So bark then becomes a place where you get a lot of action on the fire. There's a lot of things that take place. And also it seems to be the one place where there's a lot of overlap between pest species and wildfire. I was trying to think of it, what's the best one I could show you? And so I've talked about the importance of the thickness of this bark, but if you look at this clearwing moth's damage, this moth has basically taken a 2-inch thick or 3-inch thick bark and removed everything except the last 1.5 inches, in some cases even coming closer. It's also introduced inadvertently pathogens. So what's happened now is the amount of tissue that the tree could actually use to defend itself against radiant, convective, or even combusting heat is basically cut by over half. So in this case, this tree is no longer nearly as well protected as a tree which hasn't burned. And so this moth, by having done this damage, has basically hastened the possible demise of this tree in a fire. And that's one of the best sort of synergistic things I can say. Another thing that happens is that when you have a species like the gold spotted oak boar, then it can cause damage to the cambium, and you get this callus tissue I talked about a moment ago. But this also now has reduced the cambium's position from being 2 or 3 inches inside this insulating bark to now, in some cases, being only a 1/2 inch from the insulating bark. So now the tree again is more prone to be damaged by wildfire. So, I'm ahead of myself here. So I think that one of the things that we say about oak trees, besides the fact that they live for 100 years and die for 100 years, they are home to a remarkable number of insects. You know, it's at least 260 different insects have been reported to be on oaks, and specifically coast live oak. I think the total number for oaks is up to 5,000. But the important thing about that is that even that number is probably low. So oaks have a tremendous amount of biodiversity. And one of the reasons is because they have a deep root system, they basically are one of the few things that stays green in many of our chaparral, grassland, and oak woodland ecosystems. And they provide a remarkable amount of resources. That thick bark is also sugared carbohydrates. And so you just think about this tree as sequestering a huge amount of resources, and lots of things use it. One of the things that uses it is, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I was going to start talking about, I'm rushing because I'm trying to give enough time for Jolene and Tom and the people who really can tell you about gold spotted oak boar. But anyway, let's go back to just really quickly to talk about interaction of insects with oak trees. And our standard model is oaks grow to recover from insect damage. That is, they get damaged and they grow around the problem and they continue, and that they're always sort of declining from cumulative injury or damage from insects. That's a dynamic balance. Basically, it's governed by what I talked about before of drought and other stressors. And the balance kind of always tips negative. In other words, sooner or later, every oak tree dies. And the reasons that they usually are dying is because they reach a limit of their resources. They can't take any more resources. They're attacked by something and they no longer have the ability to outgrow it. The other thing is, just over time, oaks accumulate a number of injuries, damages that occur. It's just a matter of being in the landscape and having things happen. And at some point you accumulate too many of those, again, to mount a response to an insect pest. This is an example of this. This is one of the cross sections that we've used in our study. And you can just see all of the things that are happening to this oak tree. Now, this oak tree was standing, and anybody walking past it would say, oh, that's a great looking oak tree. But you look at the damage: western oak bark beetle, heart rot, canker funguses coming in from the outside, flathead borer damage, gold spotted oak borer damage, fires that have occurred in the past. So you can just sort of see that this tree is reaching a point where it's going to have a hard time mounting any kind of defenses. And that's one of the things that really makes a tree susceptible to gold spotted oak borer. So I just want to say there's a lot of complexity to looking at interactions, and I think I've just skipped over the surface, and I hope I've given you enough interesting ideas that we can move on to gold spotted oak borer now. So just I want to say some general things. Lots of people can say things that are more specific, but most times now that we tend to discover GSOB outbreaks in their third year, that is pretty much after they have established. You don't see the damage in the first year or two, especially if it's not a drought year. So prevention is still our best strategy, and that's why we say don't move firewood. And firewood basically that can have fully intact GSOB, no matter what the firewood looks like. They can be in it for the entire year before the flight season, and they can show up at a new location and basically establish populations. And this has happened sometimes at distances up to 120 miles. So this is the prevention is the best strategy, and that involves not importing firewood. Second big point is eradication is never likely. We can reduce it, we can make the damage lessened, but we cannot basically eradicate it. That's an idea that we might have entertained initially when we thought we could fight a war and win, but it's just not happening. But it is possible to reduce their population and reduce them to the point where you don't see a whole lot of mortality. You know, the mortality may be slightly higher than the ambient mortality in the woodland to begin with. The other thing we can do is we can control hotspots. We can control those places where you have trees that are producing a whole lot of beetles and are creating a whole lot of mortality in a pocket. The last thing is we can also protect individual trees. So we've gotten pretty good at these techniques. It will probably likely be with us for a long time, and we can hope that it moves very, very slowly to the majority of oak woodlands across the state. In terms of management actions, some of the most important things is to monitor what the beetle is doing in any given woodland, because it gives you an opportunity to know what's going on. So I think we've shifted from just going out and cutting down trees and removing them whenever we see a GSOB tree to having concentrated activities where we try to go out and find all the trees that have GSOB, locate the hot spots, and actually follow the emergence of the beetles so we know when our management efforts will be the most effective. And those management efforts include removal of dead and declining trees, pesticide treatments, which include barrier sprays and systemic pesticides. And those really are the three tools that we have, and sort of monitoring trees so we can decide how to assign trees to what category and then work their treatments after that. So really briefly, this is a gold spotted oak borer gallery seeded cross section. It's right along the surface of the cambium. They're etching just 15 to 30% of this damage is done into the wood, into the xylem. And most of it, you know, like basically 70 to 85% is just taking out this really good bark, which is full of sugars. After they've done this for the summer, in October, they basically move out to the edge. Their gallery is tipping along the side of the tree to the point where they actually typically break out on the surface of the tree. Once they do that, they move back in and they create a pupal chamber. Here's a kind of the outline of the pupal chamber where we've scraped away all the healthy tissue, and this is the home that the beetle has made for itself to pupate. And then the beetle stays in until May or April at the low elevations and June in the higher elevations, when they actually pupate into beetles and then chew out of the tree. So this is kind of what the beetles are doing. The main damage that they do is that they cause damage to the cambium. And if you look at that big gallery right there, this is kind of on the same scale. If this gallery occurs in a rainfall year that's really small, they can literally be etching down into the vessels, and you can see mortality in the very first year that they're there. Typically, though, they're just taking a certain amount of wood and they're reducing the efficiency of the xylem, but they don't actually kill trees in a good rainfall year.
If you don't mind wrapping up, because
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I could just stop right there. I've said my piece. In fact, I should have stopped at the last slide with GSOB. So anyway, let me just go to one last slide, and that shows all the partners who've worked on this, and there are a remarkable group of people that worked on this project, and two of which I hope I've left enough time for to speak.
Thank you so much, Tom. So I'm going to introduce now our panelists. And again, remember for all the attendees that you can start putting your questions in the Q&A box ahead of time if you have them already. And we'll answer all of them at the end, or as many as we can. So our panelists are Jolene Tam. She is with La Jolla Tribe Environmental Department at UC Riverside and UC Riverside. Tom Smith, he's a forest pathology and entomology at Cal Fire. And Steve Baer, he's the resources officer and forestry specialist at U.S. Forest Service. So with that, I'll let Jolene, who's already put her slides on, so take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Tom, for your presentation. So my name's Jolene. I am a graduate researcher studying at UCR under Dr. Mark Cottle, but I'm also the natural resource manager with the La Jolla Tribe, who I'm not really representing in this presentation, but working here gives me a good idea of how research needs to solve real world problems. So with that, I'll be talking about indigenous cultural and prescribed burning for management of gold-spotted oak borer and how our research is attempting to solve this issue. Gold-spotted oak borer, scientific name is Agrillus aurigutatus. I'm going to be calling it GSOB from here on out, make it nice and simple. It's very small, the size of a grain of wild rice with 6 gold spots. It's invasive. It was first linked to oak mortality in 2008 from the Arizona mountains, which Tom mentioned. And it's the host trees that it targets are the coast live oak, California black oak, and canyon live oak. The symptoms of GSOB tree injury are bark bleeding and cracking, D-shaped exit holes, shallow woodpecker foraging, tree mortality, and larval galleries. Our research objectives are to determine if cultural burning, a traditional Native American landscape management practice, can be used to manage GSOB. 2, to determine a heat treatment guideline for GSOB infested oak firewood. And then to use these results to develop a prescribed fire-based landscape level management practice to manage GSOB. Indigenous cultural burning is a landscape stewardship tool that's intertwined with cultural practices to increase harvest and decrease insects such as the filbert weevil, which are known to infest harvestable acorns. Traditional ecological knowledge tells us that the ashes are known to make the acorn trees grow better and to kill the bugs that feed on the leaves and the acorns. And Western research has shown that ash and charcoal do cause injury to the insect's exoskeleton, causing desiccation and death. GSOB has an annual life cycle, and we're going to use this life cycle to target an integrated pest management approach to target GSOB when it's most vulnerable directly under the outer bark. Oh, sorry. Okay, so the average pupal chamber is directly underneath the outer bark, 0 to 0.2 centimeters below, and this region is the region that's most affected during a fire. This chart shows that D-shaped exit holes are primarily found on the lower 6 meters of the tree, with the density increasing the nearer to the ground that the tree stem is. For a heat treatment study, to determine the heat treatment protocols, we're monitoring the core temperature of each piece of firewood and the core temperature of the bark, and making sure that those temperatures reach 60 degrees Celsius for 60 minutes. The preliminary results for this heat treatment study show a 98% reduction in exit holes. The 2 exit holes that I did count, they may indicate the emergence of an insect with reduced fitness or chronic mortality, or I missed them when I did the original count. So, but we're going to be redoing this experiment this year. So hopefully I'll have a larger sample size to base better results off of. We're also doing prescribed pile burn experiments on an infested stump. This stump here, this excised area was a 2 square foot area, which I extracted 47 larvae from. We monitored the temperature, the internal temperature of the tree and the site conditions. And these preliminary results showed a 90% reduction in adult emergence, even though the target temperature and duration was not met, and the heat was not applied to the back side of the stump. This might indicate that heat, pressure, ash, and charring may inhibit emergence. And then we're also monitoring burn plots in Mount Laguna, the Cleveland National Forest. Before and after the fire, the prescribed burn plots are, I totally mixed up my words. Okay, we're installing plots in Mount Laguna and monitoring the effects of the prescribed burn on emergence. And the take-home messages are that we're using prescribed fire for a possible landscape level management tool to decrease GSOB, and that GSOB is vulnerable where it pupates in the outer bark within the portions of the tree most affected during a prescribed fire, and that a return to cultural burning knowledge which has proved successful in the past for native forest insects, and it has potential for GSOB population level suppression over large areas of difficult terrain. And if you have any questions, you can always email me, or if we have time, I can take them afterwards. And thank you to my many supporters. And I think that was 5 minutes, I hope.
That was perfect. Thank you, Jolene.
Thank you.
Tom Smith, you want to go ahead and take your turn? Oh, you're muted. There you go. No.
Try again.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
You.
Okay. I don't have a presentation. I just have a bunch of different comments to make. And one of the things is just jumping on what Jolene said there. It's like she's doing all this research on fire and gold-spotted oak borer. Guess what? As far as invasive pests go, we really have very little information about the effects of fire on the invasive pests and the effects of the invasive pests on fire. But I just wanted to mention a few other pests that we need to be watching out for when we're trying to do these restoration efforts. Yes, gold-spotted oak borer is going to be a real problem for a lot of areas. It's getting moved around in firewood, as Tom Scott mentioned. Other things are getting moved around as well. One of the things we'll have to watch out for in our restoration efforts, the invasive shot-hole borers, both Polyphicus and Corrotio shot-hole borer. Huge host ranges. Oaks are in that host range, by the way, including English oak and coast live oak, the big one being coast live oak as far as restoration would go. This is mostly a problem in urban areas and riparian areas, but it is getting into the oak woodlands. It is getting into the forest. So we do want to try to keep that out. Another pest of particular interest for oaks is the Mediterranean oak borer. It's a pest more up in Northern California. Right now, it's in Lake Sonoma, Napa counties with a satellite infestation in Sacramento County. It's getting moved around as well in untreated oak wood, particularly firewood. So it's just a matter of time before it gets down your way. This is a pest of white oaks at this point. We've really only seen it in valley oak and to a lesser extent blue oak. We don't know about Oregon white oak as a potential host because it just hasn't hit any of the Oregon white oak stands that we have up north. We did find it in one California black oak. That was a very diseased single branch on the California black oak. So there is the potential of it moving into non-white oaks as well. The other invasive disease I would be concerned about is sudden oak death disease. It's going from Monterey County all the way up into southwestern Oregon. It may be in San Luis Obispo County. We don't know yet. Eventually, it may get further south, and that would be a great concern. So we just have to keep our eyes on all these different invasive pests. The other thing that I was asked to talk about were the CAL FIRE rules and regulations dealing with restoration. And guess what? We don't have any. When it comes to restoration after fires, we basically have no rules, no regulations on that. We do have opportunities, cost sharing opportunities, grant opportunities, but we have nothing that says you have to restore an area. Basically, our rules and regulations deal with timberland, and in most cases in Southern California, you're not dealing with timberland anyway. But we do have those things. We are trying to increase our seed collection of all species. So we're always looking for partners for more seed collection so that we can be returning the correct genotypes to the correct area. Now, that is a problem with oaks in particular because we can't do seed collection of them. You can't store the acorns. We're also trying to increase our nursery production. We have very limited nursery production at this point for hardwood trees, but we are reaching out to partners. We've partnered with one of the tribes in Southern California, I'm not sure which one it is, to get hardwood nursery operations going in Southern California. The other thing we are trying to do is start an emergency forest restoration team funding so that after a fire, we can really begin on the restoration efforts almost immediately. Last thing I want to mention is there is a group, the Oak Genetic Conservation Consortium, which is looking at protecting oak genotypes and also restoring oak genotypes to areas. They have a particular interest in Southern California and the Channel Islands, but their work is all over the country. We're looking at a number of oak species, and particularly those with limited ranges or major losses of habitats. They're seeking partners. You can contact me and I can get you in with the group. And they're also looking for locations to set up seed orchards. Since we can't store the acorns, we basically have to store the genotype trees and then harvest the acorns from them to grow our trees. And that's really all that I have. So let's move on to the next person.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Tom, is it all right if I drop your email into the chat box so that those who would like to contact you on any of those issues can do so?
Please do so.
All right, so we get our next panelist, Steve. You want to take the mic?
Sure. Good afternoon. It's Steve Bear. I'm the resource officer for the Los Angeles Gateway Ranger District. I've been on the forest almost 40 years. So seen a lot of trees come and go, a lot of pests and stuff. Beatrice, could you bring up that graph that I sent earlier this morning?
Did you send it to Anika, maybe?
Yeah, I think so.
Let me take a look for that, Steve. Just 1 second.
Anyway, I don't have a real presentation. The graph is just going to show the kind of the 4 stages of what we're doing treating with GSOB. I think like Theory said, we did have some of the oak stands that had GSOB in them have fires go through them. We think there may be, as they're looking at prescribed burning, we're looking at prescribed burning 2 under GSOB stands. It looks to be like there was some effect of lowering the susceptibility of the tree, or at least keeping it in check for a while. Although I don't know if that, it doesn't look like the duration of that is very long, because in that area that we had that, and it's not scientific, we didn't do any, cause and effect type studies or anything like that. Just looks like GSOB is back there. So it looks like it may be a temporary thing. I think you're going to have to do, if you use that tool, like any tool, or dry burning we use in fuels, 1 to 5 years is the interval that you're going to need to do that, just because the vegetation grows. So even under the oak stands. My main purpose is that, for me, is that we do GSOB management since about 2015. That's when we found the GSOB in the oak trees in Green Valley, mostly on the edges with the private property. I believe that the county found it earlier than that, but our survey showed it up in 2015. So since 2015, we've been surveying. We do a yearly survey. We check out new areas. Basically, for us, the GSOB has stayed mainly within the Green Valley area. We do have some branching out in some areas down along Bouquet Canyon, which is an adjacent canyon, but it's fairly slow. So starting in 2017, we started to take out highly infested trees, those trees that have 10 to 25 exit holes in them, ones that have the declining crowns and have subs of showing weeping. So since then, we've every year we try to remove trees. In 2019-20, we started our spraying. We did 2 decision memos, one for tree removal, rather large area, and then the spraying is in an area around the Green Valley Community Center, which is under special use permit, and then we have a campground on the other side of the road. Preliminary results show that with the spraying, that we've reduced the number of exit holes, or the trees that are dying. Unfortunately, we didn't get to spray it in 21. We will do it spraying again in 22. We have about 300 to 400 trees that we spray. We're in the process of doing an environmental assessment we call MARA, which is an acronym for GSOB management across risk areas. It's probably going to take in about 4,000 acres. Most of what we have, what we call Sierra Pelona mountains, mostly areas that we can get into. There's 2 tiers. Tier 1 is areas around administrative sites, rec sites. That's about 853 acres. And then tier 2 is those areas outside tier 1 that are basically accessible by roads. And that's about 3,800 acres or so. So hopefully we'll have that finished in the spring. That'll allow us to do not only GSOB spraying, but more intensive inventory. We do have GSOB on the edge of our border at Wrightwood. We're now working on with a grant from CCI grant from the state on a more active outreach, because it's just starting there. We don't think it's moved on the Forest Service land yet. It is on private land. So once we have our NEPA done, then we can go in. We're going to look at we're going to start using systemic insecticides. ArborJet has some. They had a meeting at Green Valley, and they demonstrated some. So we'll be doing that. So we're expanding our thing into getting into, especially into thinnings. See how that does for decreasing density, prescribed burning, and the chemical treatments, and of course removals. We don't think we'll ever get out of removing trees, simply because you can't get them all. And by the time you detect some of these, they're already at the point of being brood trees. And that's what we're trying to get out is the brood trees. So we do have a program. We're probably going to be in this area for a long, long time. That's basically our program. We're very interested in see what we do in prescribed burning, because we're going to do that anyway. We do that underneath our oak stands anyway. So that's about it. Shame we couldn't bring up that thing.
Yeah, my apologies, Steve. I wasn't able to locate that. I never received it, but
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for to all the panelists and presenter. We have time for maybe one quick question.